Focal length series from a single vantage point. We've been discussing quite a few numbers in regard to lenses related to angle of view, sensor sizes, and focal lengths. Let's take a look at a series of photographs all made from the same vantage point. Our main purpose here is to show how the angle of view is narrowed and how that affects the picture content. I started out with a Canon 5D Mark II camera having a full-frame sensor for the widest angle lenses. And then to achieve longer telephoto effects with the same set of lenses, I switched to a Canon 40D later on in the sequence because it has a smaller sensor. You know, because you are a good student, that when using a full-frame sensor, there is no multiplier factor for the lens. The effect of a 50mm normal lens is the same normal rendering you would expect. You also know that when I switched to a camera with a smaller sensor, the effective focal length of any given lens would be longer than the actual focal length. The result of that small sensor is a multiplier factor, effectively making any lens more telephoto. For example, using the Canon 40D camera with a smaller sensor and a 1.6 multiplier, that's also known as the crop factor, the effective focal length for an actual 400mm lens would become 640. Multiply 400 by 1.6, and you get 640. And my 600mm lens effectively became a 960mm. You can see here, the 500mm at 1.6 becomes an 800mm. It's just a little bit of math. Here's our first photograph in the sequence. And again, this was with my 5D full sensor, very wide angle view made with a 15mm lens that's often referred to as a fisheye. Remember that with this full frame sensor, any focal length shorter than 50mm is considered wide angle. 50mm is the normal lens for that full frame sensor. Here, the angle of view is 180 degrees, horizontally left to right. The architect of the building on the right would not be very happy with the way the perfectly straight column elements they designed now look quite bowed. The next photograph is made with a 24mm lens, which has a 74-degree angle of view. You can see it's quite dramatically different from that fisheye. The human eye has an angle of view of about 120 degrees, but within that 120 degrees is a central area of our most focused gaze, which is about 60 to 70 degrees. For many people, this focal length, 24mm, with a full-frame sensor, feels like what they might see as their normal look at the scene. A 35mm lens, again with the full-frame sensor, has an angle of view of about 54 degrees. You can see that we're narrowing in just a bit. When we move it up to 50mm, which we know is the normal focal length, our angle of view is only 40 degrees. Now, many people get confused about this because they say, gee, a 50mm, if that's the normal focal length, it should have the same angle of view. Well, you already have seen that the 24mm is closer to that. Remember that what we're talking about with normal is the normal perspective. With the 70mm lens, we've got a narrower field of view yet, 29 degrees. And I might use the term field of view and angle of view interchangeably. You can too. You have my permission. When we move to a 105mm lens, our angle of view narrows further to 20 degrees. And you can start to see the object of my attention far in the distance. That's the Capitol Dome in Lansing, Michigan, which happens to be the capital of the state of Michigan. We move up to a 150 millimeter lens, and now we're looking at a picture that most people would start to recognize and say, hey, this is looking like a telephoto picture. And that would be true even if they didn't see the first set of photographs before it. There's something about this photograph that starts to give people signals that a telephoto lens was used. And one of those things is the sense that objects look closer together than they might naturally look to their mind's eye. And if you look at the lampposts on the right-hand side, you'll see how they start to create a pattern. And you may never have been to Lansing, may never have seen these lampposts, but they just don't feel right to most people. They feel too close together. We move up to a 240 millimeter lens. Well, our lampposts are pretty much cropped out of the picture now, but the 4 or so that remain almost look the same size. It's like a Chinese painting perspective, in that things that we think are in the distance are rendered the same sizes. And we're starting to really narrow our view, coming down Michigan Avenue, bordering in the State Capitol Dome now with those buildings. We've got a 9-degree angle of view in this picture. The 300 millimeter lens, which is only 60 millimeters longer, makes a dramatic change. The top of the dome is cropped off. The buildings are certainly becoming more abstract elements. And rather than looking like buildings that are in the foreground, notice how they start to look almost like cutouts, almost like pieces of cardboard on the left and the right that are at the same distance in a way as the Capitol Dome. With the 400 millimeter lens, well, hardly any portion of those buildings on the left and the right are left, but the little parts that are certainly just look like they might be right level with that perspective of the dome, other than for the fact that the lighting on the dome and the lighting on the building on the left is so different. In this photograph made with a 500 millimeter lens, we've got a 4-degree angle of view. Now, I didn't have a 500 millimeter lens to shoot this picture with. I used my Canon Zoom 100 to 400, and I set it at a focal length that would be about 320 millimeters, enough to make it a 500 millimeter effective picture, switching now to my Canon 40D camera. Remember, the 40D camera has a smaller sensor with a 1.6 multiplier. While I prefer a full-frame sensor for the larger file sizes that are possible with that format, the advantage for me, and maybe for you too, of having also an APS-C sensor camera in my camera bag is that when you need just a bit more telephoto capability, you've got it just by switching camera bodies. With the 600 millimeter lens, we've now got a 3.4 degree angle of view. Now, this was a true 600 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. The 960 millimeter lens with a 2.1 degree angle of view was really my 600 millimeter using it on the APS-C sensor camera. With the 1.6 multiplier, that brought it all the way up to 960, almost 1,000 millimeter lens. Whether you are using fixed focal length lenses or zoom lenses, the more you use them, the more you will develop an innate understanding of what angle of view to anticipate at any setting. This innate ability to anticipate the angle of view can save you time in selecting the proper lens for the situation you want to photograph. And when that scene involves changing action, it can also be the difference between getting the picture or losing it. You'll find that you start to intuitively pop the proper lens on the camera to respond to the type of photograph you want to make. And that is when you'll really know that you're getting in tune with your equipment, and also with your sense of what aspects of this world of content you're interested in framing in the most.